Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this evening session of the Brainwash Festival, in which I have the honor to have a conversation with two of my favorite writers, Otessa Moshfegh and Olivia Lang, about today's central theme, collective loneliness. My name is Oscar Kokke, and I will be your host tonight. And when I got this invitation, I had to grasp it with both hands, not only because I could speak to those two writers, but also because it provided me with a legal chance to leave my home, to finally meet people in real life, in this case, the wonderful people of the festival crew. And it gave me a chance to have my very first curfew exemption. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to go out tonight, to walk and be all alone in this very, very, very lonely city. And that brings me to my first guest, art critic Olivia Lang, who is the writer of the book The Lonely City, translated as De Eenzame Stad. A book about works of art, paintings, performances, etc., that present an image of loneliness or arise out of loneliness itself. But it's also a really intimate record of a personal quest to master the difficult art of being alone. Olivia Lang, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's an honor to have you on this show. How are you? How are you doing during this lockdown?
Well, now I'm just really jealous of you for getting to be out of the house.
Yeah, you have to stay at home.
I'm in my house. I've been in my house for 9,000 years.
Oh, poor you.
Yeah, no, I am totally fine. And there's sort of light at the end of the tunnel now because it looks like we will get out of lockdown later on in the spring. But yeah,
That's what they tell you, but do you believe him?
I'm praying. You know, I need my hair cut. Yeah, it's a difficult time, and it feels amazing to be able to talk to people across the world by way of a computer screen, and at the same time, I just want to talk to people in person. I'm just so sick of this sort of strange interface, which really makes you feel bodily how isolated you are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. Well, I'm glad I can talk to you this way. And before we dive into your work, I would like to say to the audience that are watching right now, you can ask your questions as well. There is a button, Ask a Question button. You can ask the questions and I will ask the questions on your behalf. So, let's start. Please, Olivia, take me back to the beginning of your book, The Lonely City. It's a few years ago. What was the starting point? Why did you want to write about loneliness? Did you want to write about loneliness?
Well, I did. That's the funny thing. I didn't want to be lonely. So a relationship had come to an end abruptly, short relationship, but one that I'd invested a lot in. I was in my mid-30s. Everyone around me was getting married, having children, and I moved to New York and I plunged into this experience of intense loneliness. So I felt very isolated, very self-conscious about being isolated. You know, it's the city of glass. You're constantly aware of other people's lives. From your apartment building, you can see many other people. And that feeling sort of really redoubled the kind of loneliness and shame that I was feeling.
Shame.
But at the same time, the writer in me was like, hang on, this is really fascinating. This is an experience people don't like to talk about. They don't write about very much. And I'm completely sort of gripped by what it feels like, what causes it, where does it come from, what kind of experiences might arise out of it, what kind of art might arise out of it. So that was the origin story, really.
Yeah, you started to investigate loneliness in art, but also loneliness itself. Can you describe what is loneliness to you?
I think we often think that loneliness is solitude, so we think that it just means physically being alone, and it isn't. Loneliness is the experience of wanting more intimacy than you have, wanting more contact than you have. So while you can be very lonely when you're physically alone, you can also be lonely in a marriage, you can be lonely at a party, you can be lonely in a crowd. And I think that sort of complexity of the experience was part of what fascinated me about it. And the other thing to say is that we as a species, perhaps, and certainly we culturally, regard loneliness as abhorrent, the worst crime. You know, there's something so shameful about it. It's so hard to say to another person, I feel very lonely right now. So that sort of builds another layer of loneliness around the loneliness. And that sort of experience of becoming more and more buried alive inside it, frozen inside it, is terrifying, but also, again, as a writer, very fascinating.
Yeah, loneliness causes loneliness.
Loneliness causes loneliness, yeah.
So you write something like, at the same time we long for intimacy, but we also reject it. We build a wall around us. We're afraid of contact.
I think we're afraid of contact, and we're also afraid of rejection. That the idea that you might reach out to somebody, that you might sort of expose your inner self and have that turned down is very, very frightening. And I think people often go, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, people, me, can go a long way to avoid taking those kind of risks. And in some ways it can feel easier to have the sort of comforting pain of loneliness to the terror of having to get close to somebody else and having to take those sort of risks of abandonment and engulfment.
Mm. So we'd rather go for a self-chosen solitude then?
I think sometimes, yeah, it's very easy to sort of, that was, so in The Lonely City I talk about a lot of artists, and one of them is Andy Warhol, and, you know, we think of him as being such a social person,
yes,
but he was somebody who very much was terrified of closeness, terrified of intimacy, terrified of sexuality, terrified of all of those sort of contact risks, and you know, found all sorts of complex ways to mediate his relationships with people, often by using technology in very similar ways to how we use our little smartphones now.
Yeah, of course we will talk about the art, but I want to stay a little bit with loneliness itself. You talk about the feeling of being ashamed. Why is that? Because it doesn't help to be ashamed. Why are we?
That was the thing I found most interesting, I think. It was realizing that the most painful aspect of loneliness was shame, and shame is not a necessary component of loneliness. So I think the reason is just we are social animals. We need to be around other people to some extent in our lives. That is an essential. And the idea that we've failed at that, especially in this social media heavy world that we're in right now, where your level of contacts is very visible to other people. Your amount of friends on Facebook is very visible. The amount of likes you get, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, all of that performance of friendship, performance of sociality makes us so vulnerable if we're failing at it. It's appalling in this sort of social media age to not be successful at sociality. And I think that creates such a lot of shame for people. And it's so, you know, I wrote The Lonely City 5 years ago and have done hundreds of events since, and it's often young, terribly attractive, very engaging people who'll come up to me in the queue tearfully and say how desperately lonely they are. And I think so much of that is to do with this idea that social media is creating a false reality of how much friendship, how much community other people have, and everyone's competing in that. And an awful lot of people feel like they're a failure in it.
I won't say that I am terrible attractive, but still, I was one of those people that sometimes had to cry while reading it.
You're very attractive, it's
yeah,
true.
thank you, thank you. That was the goal, yeah. Now, I was reading your book, and in a way, I felt like I was seen. It felt like you understood a basic level of the core of being lonely.
And actually, I think that core, you know, it sounds funny, but I think that's really beautiful. I think people's vulnerability is really beautiful. And maybe something about the book is that it gives people permission to just feel that it's okay to long. It's okay to wish that you had more than you have. It's all right to feel those feelings of uncertainty and tenderness and tentativeness, none of that's a crime. It's actually okay to be lonely. And especially right now in this moment where it is so difficult to find the kind of connections that we want.
Yes. Yeah, and that makes it even more important to talk about it, to share this, this feeling of loneliness, to share that we don't know how to do it, how to live, how to make a connection.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when you feel lonely, you feel that you are the only person who's alone. But when you stop and think about it, it's obvious that it's such a common experience. It's a shared place. And that's what I wanted to sort of map it as, is this place that so many people travel through. Some people will be stuck there for a long time, and some people will just pass through because a relationship has ended, they've moved somewhere else, all these different sort of peripheral reasons. But we travel through this land together. And I think just becoming more kind of confident about that it's a place that other people have been to, and being able to talk about it, being able to share it with each other, takes away so much of the fear about it.
Yes. One way of sharing this is art. Is art even a cure for loneliness?
Well, it kind of was for me. I think I just needed evidence that other people, I was trapped in this place, and I just needed evidence that other people had been there before me and that they'd survived it. And in fact, some of them even thrived inside it. So I didn't want to write a book where I said, and then I met somebody and now I'm in a relationship and it's fine, it's all over. I felt like that was really sort of betraying the experience that I had. And what happened to me with art and with the kind of artists I was exploring was just this real recognition that people had been to that place, people had been very lonely, people had made beautiful things out of it. It was clear that it wasn't a shameful experience. It was clear that it was a shared experience. And it was clear that it was a sort of invisible space that is enormously complex, interesting, rich. So I became more and more fascinated by it.
Yeah, you wrote about several artists. Edward Hopper is one of them, most famously known because of Nighthawks. What fascinated you about his work?
This, to me, is just the archetypal painting of what loneliness feels like. So, first of all, in itself, it's a painting of people isolated in a city. There's one guy and there's the person trapped behind the counter, and these people aren't talking to each other. Nobody's looking at each other. You get this feeling of a sort of alienated city scene. But then step back, what's actually happening is that you're being put in the position of somebody who's standing out in the street. It's late at night, maybe it's sort of just before dawn. There's this greenish light seeping out, very unnatural, very electric. And you are separated from everybody else by a thick layer of glass. And that absolutely encapsulated for me what loneliness feels like.
So the image is not about the portrait, but about the viewer.
I think he's so clever at creating, by way of these sort of architectural setups, what different moods feel like, and often loneliness. He's the great poet of loneliness. So I think what he does magically, amazingly, is make you, the viewer, however you feel, suddenly have a little intimation of what it feels like to be a lonely person, to feel like you're shut out, to feel like you long for something that you're not going to be able to get. That awful, humiliating feeling of loneliness.
Yeah. It's not his only work that is about isolation, is it?
It's kind of all about isolation. It's sort of his big thing. I mean, he says, maybe I am a lonely one. And I think...
he doesn't really want to talk about it, does he?
He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to talk about it, but he wants to show it to you. He wants you to feel familiar with it. And I think he wants you to know that there's something beautiful about it. I feel that really strongly, that those paintings, they're painful to look at. They're sort of electric and troubling. And at the same time, they are undeniably beautiful. I mean, look at that. That is such a beautiful painting. But again, we've got the window. We've got this sense of somebody being... The city is around her, she's looking at it, but she's folded away. She's made a sort of barricade of her own body, and she's closed off by the glass again.
Yeah. Again, you see, it's maybe even more easy to feel lonely in a city where you know that all those people around you are so close, but still you don't get a connection.
Yeah. And why can't you just reach out? Why can't you break through? Why can't you make that connection? And he paints that mood. He paints that feeling so wonderfully.
Yeah, it's also about, it's not only about loneliness and isolation, it's also about detachment, not feeling at the right place at the right time, not having a connection with time itself or the whole world.
Yeah, I think a feeling of really being at sea. It's interesting. I was thinking about Nighthawks earlier, that, you know, he painted it just after Pearl Harbor. So at the moment when America was ending its isolation and going into the war. And I wonder whether that unease is in it as well. And thinking about it in terms of where we are now, you know, we're globally in this sort of quarantine situation. We're all pulled back into our spaces. And there's something in it about an anxiety about contact as well, that at some point this glass is going to come down and you're going to have to rejoin people again. And the fear around that, that's something that I hadn't seen in it before and I'm starting to see in it now, is actually, doesn't the glass make people safe? And isn't it going to be frightening when we're all suddenly in a room together? Wonderful, but frightening.
Yeah. You said he didn't want to talk about what he meant, why he painted it. He didn't want to talk about his so-called loneliness. Is it important to know whether he was lonely?
I don't think so, no. I find it interesting personally, but I don't think we need to know what an artist's biographical experience was to read their paintings, to understand what their paintings mean. I think they're painting something that is pretty universal and that we can see for ourselves. To me, more the fact that he was so speechless, that he struggled so much to communicate, is interesting, because I think that speechlessness you can feel very strongly in his work, this sense of something very sort of buttoned up. But, you know, I don't need to know that he was authentically lonely for his paintings to mean a lot to me about the authentic feeling of loneliness. They feel accurate, and I think that's enough.
Yeah, and maybe, in fact, everybody is lonely?
Yeah, we think so right now, don't we?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. Another artist you write about in your book, David Wojnarowicz. He's a little less known. Tell me about him.
He is such a fantastic artist. So he was really a street kid in New York, and he was homeless, and he got hold of a camera and he began to take photos. And this is the first series that he did, Rambo in New York, which is photos of male friends, male lovers, all wearing this mask, which is Rambo, the Rambo mask from the cover of Illuminations. Mm-hmm. You know, he made it out of paper, he cut it out, put a string behind it. And it's these wonderful images of urban isolation, this person who is different from everybody else, this person who is just gazing implacably back at you, haunting, melancholy, longing, unable to make contact because, unable to show themselves. I just found them, as soon as I saw the pictures, I thought, I have to write about this person. I don't know who they are. I need to find out. And although I've just said I didn't need to know about Hopper's life, with Wojnarowicz, I just felt so compelled to find out more and more about him. He's the artist, I think, out of my life who I've been most drawn to, most felt a sort of affinity, because his voice is so powerful. He died of AIDS very young, in his 30s, but he left behind diaries, audio diaries, all of these very intimate records of what his life was like. And he's just an extraordinary artist. You're right, he's not so well known, but he is starting to have now big shows in America and in Europe. So I think people are getting to know him. Yeah,
and in his view, loneliness had a political component.
Absolutely. He's one of the great artists of the AIDS era. So he was diagnosed HIV positive in his early 30s. And that work that we've just seen of the stitched lips is summing up the ACT UP slogan, silence equals death. So he's made this sort of incredibly visceral portrait of what it feels like to be stigmatized and silenced, to have no voice, and the rage of that. And I think the other thing I really wanted to talk about in the book was loneliness isn't just an individual failing. It's not that an individual is a loser. It's so much to do with political forces. It's so much to do with the kind of people who are stigmatized, who are forced into isolation, whose bodies are regarded as repellent, all of these different things. And Moshfegh was somebody who just pushed back against that, who refused that kind of isolation.
Yeah. It's not a personal failure, but maybe a systemic failure.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
There's a question. Gigi wants to know, how do you think societal concepts of companionship influence people's feelings toward their loneliness?
Oh, I think that's so important, that we have these very oppressive ideas about the kind of relationships we ought to be in, the kind of time that we ought to be in them, what our lives should look like. And that is just, it haunts people. I think, it wasn't a coincidence that I came to write this book in my mid-30s, and that the feeling then of intense failure to do with not having the kind of relationships that I was supposedly supposed to have was deeply painful. So, yeah, I think resisting that pressure and allowing our lives to fall out how they will, allowing us to have something that looks different, something that feels different. It doesn't need to be that marriage, family, children at particular ages. You don't have to hit those milestones, and you're not doing something wrong if you haven't hit those milestones.
While you're saying this, I feel that it really means something to you. It still hurts a little, doesn't it?
I mean, I'm married, so these days I'm
but still, it's not only about you.
But I feel very passionately about that. I feel like I see it, I see young readers so much, and I see that the shame that people are carrying around is destructive. It's poisonous. It hurts people. And the actual experience of loneliness itself isn't that painful. It's this shame that's so painful, and it's unnecessary. It's completely, if I'm here for anything, it's to say there's nothing wrong with being lonely. You're not a failure as a person. You're not ugly as a person. You haven't made a mistake as a person. There are so many reasons that we can tumble into loneliness, and there are so many reasons that we can tumble back out again. And a lot of those reasons are out of our hands. And at the same time, a lot of those reasons are social, and they can be resisted socially. They can be resisted politically. We can refuse to stigmatise other people. We can refuse to treat other people as if they're to be stigmatised. So much of this is about kindness.
You started this conversation when you talked about your motivation to write this book. You told us about your personal situation, and you emphasized the fact you were a woman in her mid-20s. You were a woman. Is it a gendered issue as well? Does it make a difference whether you're...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's always layers to these things, but I think there's something about, masculine loneliness that's kind of cool, and it's got a sort of sheen to it. And I think it's harder, there's still all of that baggage around spinster, the sense that a woman alone is somehow a failure in a way that a man alone isn't. I mean, I don't buy into those things, but I think they're so culturally prevalent. They lean on us hard. Those sort of attitudes lean on us. It's difficult to wriggle out of them entirely. And I think when we were talking about sort of the sense of being in a city and eyes on you, that was certainly one of the voices that ran through my head was, this feeling of pressure around what your life should look like, what you should have achieved, and what it feels like if you haven't.
Yeah. Which brings me to the question of Barbara. She asks, why all these examples are about male artists? Is that a coincidence?
No, it was the stuff that I was feeling drawn by at the time. I mean, there are female artists all the way through the book. So there's Nan Goldin, there's Valerie Solanas, an incredibly interesting woman artist who shot Andy Warhol and now is remembered solely for shooting Andy Warhol, but was also really interesting in her own right. And Greta Garbo. And what I was trying to do with the women in the book is just show that the male stories have this sort of glamour around them, and the female stories have much more kind of abjection that, Andy Warhol struggles with contact. He's gay, he has these sort of difficulties, but at the end of the day, he's Andy Warhol, he's a superstar. Valerie Solanas, lesbian in New York, talented, vibrant, full of ideas. But she doesn't find her footing in the same way. She doesn't find success in the same way. And she ends up dying in a homeless shelter in just appalling conditions, suffering from mental illness. And I think those sort of cultural stories of how male artists' lives are kind of reified in some way, and female artists so often can fall through the cracks, certainly in the 20th century, and I think still now, that those stories really matter to me, that there were always female characters running through it, and that it was often much harder for them to navigate.
Tessa wonders, she says, the lonely artist is also a cliche, as if the loneliness is necessary for great art. Is it?
Nah, I don't think so. I think you can totally make art in states of happiness, boredom, all sorts of different moods. I mean, I'm trying to, or I was 5 years ago, trying to build a map of what loneliness looked like. And for me, it makes sense to look at what kind of art has been built out of that sort of state and what kind of art portrays it. So it's one mood, it's one aspect of things. I don't think by any means artists have to be lonely. At the same time, I think there's something about writing in particular that it's hard to, I mean, I write in, or I used to in the old days, write in airports, write on trains, write in social situations, but there's some level at which you do have to be alone in some sort of way. Virginia Woolf has this nice line that's like, to hear the singing of the real world. You've got to close off something to tune into something else. So I think loneliness plays a part in artistic creation, but I mean, so do lots of other things. Selfishness plays a huge role in artistic creation.
And also awareness of all those feelings, I guess.
Yeah, an ability to sort of tune into things. But I think the cliche side of it of like, oh, you can only create out of great pain. I mean, for fuck's sake, you can create out of many different moods.
We talked about male artists and female artists. You had an example of contemporary work. Chantal
Goffey,
yes. What does she make?
So Chantal is a contemporary painter and works in portraits, and this just blew me away. She painted it during the first lockdown in Britain, so I guess this is probably, does it say a date? Yeah, so this is early April last year, and it's her sister and her niece standing in their doorway, and it just seemed to capture for me the utter terror of that moment, the sense of, I mean, looking out into the light but not being able to cross the threshold into the light, the home as a sort of safe space, but also like the blackness of it, the terrifying space that we're sort of caught in these prisons of our own lives, and the hugging close but knowing that there's no other contact. She's wearing a little blue glove. It's that point where we were also terrified about even handling our post. So it felt to me like a real kind of iconic lockdown work, iconic pandemic work. It really caught for me what that first year felt like.
Yeah. What do we like about watching art that is about loneliness?
Well, it makes you feel company, I think. It makes you, I mean, it really is like sort of scratches on the prison wall for me. It feels like somebody else was here. Somebody else is looking at this. There's some little, exactly like you said, there's some little thrill of being seen.
Yeah.
And that can feel just amazing. And actually, sometimes that's all you need is like a little kind of wave across a room can be enough to go, okay, I can continue here for a bit longer.
We are not alone.
We're not alone. No. In our loneliness, we are not alone.
So art can be a cure. Is there another thing you can think of, another way to build our cities, or did you think of that? Is there a solution in there?
I mean, I think cities have so much potential for connection, but at the same time, cities can be so frightening. Cities can be so difficult to make contact with other people. And in the same way, let's think of social media like a city. Social media offers all of these points of contact and a miracle of contact that you can dissolve space. You can be in a close relationship with somebody who's physically far distant, in fact, as we are right now. But there are these terrible pitfalls. They're dangerous spaces in that people attack each other, people are unkind to each other, people ghost each other, people turn away from each other. And all of these sort of dangers make us more and more hypervigilant, more and more nervous, more and more walled in, like the Hopper woman. So, I mean, I sound like an old hippie, but I feel like kindness, gentleness to other people, recognizing that these feelings that we have inside ourselves of vulnerability are shared, and treating other people as if that is the case, rather than treating other people as if they are all powerful and about to wound us and therefore need to be attacked.
Nothing wrong about sounding like an old hippie, but still, you are not. You're not a hippie. You're not not so peaceful at all. Because I read about your encounter with a very lonely person. You write about it, a little ashamed. A lonely old man. He came. You were sitting on a bench in a park or something. What happened?
I was at a train station. So this was in my late teens, early 20s, and it's funny. It stayed so vivid with me for 20 years now. I was outside a station waiting for my father to come and collect me, and he came and sat next to me, and he tried to make conversation, and I sort of responded politely, and then it was almost as if I could feel the force field of his loneliness. The intensity with which he wanted me to talk to him, and at the same time feel my own repulsion to it, just like get away from me. And that's kind of what I'm talking about, is it's a shared responsibility. We can't expect people to rescue us from our own loneliness if we're not willing to just take those few minutes to sit with somebody and talk. What would it have cost me to just talk for 5 more minutes?
Only time.
Really impossible. It wasn't time. It was the intensity of his need. It was as if he was bleeding out on the street, and I felt helpless. I felt terrified by it. So, still now I feel distressed by the encounter, by the scene. And that's how frightening loneliness can be. And at the same time, there isn't a cure for it apart from being able to weather our own loneliness and being willing to weather other people's. Yeah. That's it. There's no miracle.
But in a way, you were afraid to be infected by the virus of loneliness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This man, he wasn't ashamed, I guess.
No, he was ashamed. I think he was very ashamed. I think that was part of the feeling that came off him. And he was elderly as well. But no, it was the whole package of sort of shame and need that was hard to weather. I'm not saying it's easy.
If you encounter him these days, what would you do?
Well, I do all the time now. It's kind of my thing. So yeah, I talk to
really
people a lot.
Honestly?
I mean, yeah, I talk to lonely people a lot because I wrote a book about loneliness and lonely people come to talk to me a lot. So yes, I have a lot of encounters with the lonely. I think that encounter was before I had written this book, had thought about it to this level. I think I'm a lot more relaxed about it now.
Yeah. There's one more question about the topic of shame. Do you think, ask Boukje, do you think the shame aspect is stronger in British culture? I personally think loneliness is painful in its own, even if you're not ashamed by it. Yeah, that's true. Is it stronger in British culture?
I mean, we British are ashamed all the time of everything. It's not a bad thing. So yeah, maybe it is. But no, I mean, I think it certainly was in America, and perhaps even more in America, because there's even more pressure to be socially buoyant, to be socially successful. So I don't know. I can't speculate so much about sort of national emotions, but I'm not saying that loneliness doesn't have a pain component. I'm just saying that the sort of wrapping of shame creates another layer of sort of agony to it, I think.
Yeah. You try to find not only beauty in loneliness, in art, you also try to find a purpose of loneliness. What is the function? Is it any good for something. What did you find out?
I mean, there's the sort of evolutionary biology line on loneliness, which is it's painful because we have to survive by being around other people, so it provokes us to make contact with other people. I don't totally buy that. I think that loneliness is a place that we go to. It's inevitable that everyone in the world is going to experience this at some point because we are mortal, because people we love will die. You know, we might be able to evade it all through our lives, but at some point we're going to experience this feeling of longing for intimacy and longing for closeness. And I think, like grief, like rage, it's a mood, it's a feeling tone that has purpose. It's part of what makes us human. It's absurd to think that it's just things have gone wrong and therefore you have to revert to being happy. We're not going to live in these sort of universes of positive emotions all the time in our lives. And I think part of, I believe, what loneliness does is it softens people. It gives them empathy. It allows them to realise that people inhabit these spaces alongside them and that they can be kind to them. That really is my sort of line on it.
To experience your own loneliness makes you more able to listen to another person that is lonely and to help him or her out.
It's a choice. It's a choice. I mean, of course, you can allow it to wall you off and make you more cold to other people, but I think you can choose to see this as a shared state and know that other people are in it too, and then allow that to soften you.
I want to thank you very much, not only for this conversation, but also, as I already said, for giving me the feeling of being seen. And that's all because of you being so honest, so open and vulnerable. And that's a good example, and I wish to follow it. So thank you very much.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to talk. Thank you very much.
Have a good evening. Olivia Lang. Thank you. So, my second guest is Otessa Moshfer, known for novels like Laing, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, the story collection Homesick for Another World, and the recently the novel Death in Her Hands, translated as De Dood in Haar Handen. Stories full of characters that experience a sense of disconnection, estrangement, characters that long to be seen for who they really are, but at the same time seek isolation and reject all human interaction. Her books are, in a way, disturbing, confronting, but always fascinating and funny. More than once it made me laugh out loud. And although her protagonists tend to lose contact with reality, they are always relatable, at least to me. So I'm very happy I can talk to her. Welcome, Otessa Moshfer. Otessa,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being with us. How are you? How are you doing during lockdown?
Right now, I'm okay. It's been, a journey. I can't really remember what it was like a year ago. But, I think I'm one of the fortunate personality types in situations like this. Like, I'm very familiar with the feeling of being isolated and antisocial. So it's not
good for you. Yeah.
Anomaly. Yeah, so there was certainly an adjustment period, but for me, I think it was less about having to learn how to function outside of society and more about just the obvious terror of what was happening to everyone. And yeah, thinking more existentially about what it all means.
Your most recent novel, of course, it won't surprise anybody, is again about a lonely woman.
Yeah.
You called this story a loneliness story, and of course I want to know what you mean by that. But you wrote it years ago. then it ended up in a drawer, in a desk. You finally decided to publish it, and it was due to come out exactly in the beginning of this lockdown period. So,
True.
was it a coincidence, or are you a fortune teller?
No, I'm a fortune teller.
You are? Yeah, yes, I thought so.
No, I'm not. I don't feel that I'm a fortune teller, but there definitely seems to be, plenty of examples for how things make perfect sense in hindsight. But I think that's true for everyone, I wrote my year of rest and relaxation actually after I wrote Death in Her Hands. And in the last year, my year of rest and relaxation, which is about a woman who sort of chooses very willingly to live all alone in her apartment in New York. And it resembles very much like the experience of someone who might want to be avoiding a pandemic in some ways. That was written in 2016-ish. Death in Her Hands, I wrote in 2015, 2014, something like that. And when I wrote Death in Her Hands, which is about an elderly woman who has moved to a sort of lower class rural town, not even a town, let's say area, into a very simple cabin on a lake with her companion, who is a dog, having recently lost her husband, and sort of sets out to connect with the world via a note she finds on her path through the woods one morning on a walk with her dog. And it's mostly happening in her, well, we're not quite sure. She's telling us the story and we're unclear of how much is happening in reality and how much is happening in her imagination.
Yes, she finds a note telling someone is murdered, is dead, and the question is, who did it? Where is the body? And all those questions she tries to figure out, but only in her own imagination.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we can see this character doing is something similar to what I was saying about how everything makes sense in hindsight. It's like our minds are so good at creating meaning that if we start to look for clues, we will find them.
Yeah, it always makes sense.
We will build a narrative based on anything because we are creatures that love story and logic. And somehow that also allows for, I think, because of that synchronicity, that the magic that is inherent in that meaning making, it also satisfies a spiritual need that I have, at least. I don't know about most people, but to me, there's something that I think is very central to the conversation about loneliness, which is faith and the idea of there being something larger, a force, an intelligence, whatever you want to call it, that we're not just spinning in a chaos stream, but that there is something great happening.
And then it suddenly all makes sense. Oh, finally, what a relief. But is it a way of coping with loneliness, this form of imagination?
I think it can be presented as such, for sure. And, as a novelist, I'm looking for situations in which I can explore perhaps more abstract idea. So for me, loneliness was, and has often been, or isolation, loneliness, some variant of that, is a good opportunity to show a character's inward movements, rather than behaviors as they're exhibited in the performance of society. And when one explores inner movements of a character, there's a freedom that you find, because the mind is infinite and it does weird things, and it can make sense of things, it can remember things, it can go other places. And so to me, it's a very sort of facile area. And the loneliness of a character allows for me to really move interior. And that's really what I've been interested in doing until recently, is really, I have written almost exclusively in the first person, and have been exploring the mind as a storytelling voice. So that's the loneliness or isolation is really like the perfect environment for that.
Yeah. Were you lonely when you wrote this story?
Yeah, I was really lonely. I think the loneliness wasn't my most forthcoming feeling, but it was a side effect of having removed myself to a certain extent, because I had some other things going on. I just didn't want to be around other people. And that certainly affected the mood of the world that this character lives in. Yeah.
You wrote it like 5 years ago. Why publish it now? Why not keep it in the drawer? Not because I didn't like it, but...
It's funny. My year of rest and relaxation came out in the United States, and I had been on a tour in the States and in the UK and in France. And I came home to my apartment in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. And it was like something just called me toward Death in Her Hands. It's like, maybe it was the experience of this massive exposure that I had just gone through. Maybe it was a kind of pushing back against having taken part in the world in a way that I had never taken part in it before. There's something private about Death in Her Hands. It was like revisiting a very private time, and an intimacy that I didn't think that I could have I couldn't have recaptured now, because my life and my attitude has shifted, over the last several years. I couldn't have written the book now. So when I read it, I was really moved by it in a way that surprised me.
By your own writings.
Well, I don't say that to flatter myself. It's just that it moved me to remember where that came from. And, I had never thought about it as a book that I would publish. It was something that I wrote because I wanted to, not necessarily as a project with a goal. The goal for the book was to write the book. It wasn't to publish it and have it come out in Holland, So that was just something that happened. And I kind of trusted that whatever the book wanted to be in the world, it would find its way without me, kind of like I was removed. But yeah, I was moved by it. It was a story that I had almost forgotten, and it made me recall this strange and mysterious world. So I thought, I'd rather, maybe it deserves to have a life instead of just being alone in the drawer.
It's funny when I look at you and when I look in your eyes, it's almost like you fell in love with the story. Is it something like that?
Not really.
You're really charmed by it.
I mean, I thought it was. No, I mean, it's not that I was charmed by it, but you know, I did write it. It did emanate out of me, and so that's often a very moving thing. It's like looking at a photo of yourself from 5 years ago and not wanting to burn it, but to maybe, you know.
Seldom, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, even the worst pictures of me, I think at this point, I mean, I'm almost 40 years old, and like the pictures of me that are the least flattering, I don't think I would burn them now. They're actually sort of more precious in a way.
Was there a lot you had to change about the story from 5 years ago because you developed as a writer, I guess? Was there a lot to change?
No, there wasn't a lot to change. I mean, I did some fine tuning, and I actually found that when I went back to revise, I often put things back to the way that they had been. There was this sort of like finished, don't mess with it kind of feeling. Yeah, so I didn't, you know, it was a special project in that way. Usually when I write a novel, the revision process is just like seemingly endless. But that had been a different kind of procedure, Death in Her Hands, because the way that I wrote it was, like I said, without real ambition, but to try to capture something. And I began not understanding, knowing, having any idea what that thing was. I simply sat down and I had been thinking, you know, I'm going through something, which was very personal, but I'm going through an experience, and I understand that as a writer, I will do better if I attach to a creative project while I go through this. And that actually happened recently with the coronavirus and the shutdown. When it began, I thought this is an experience, and I mean, I hate the word cope. It's not to cope. It's sort of to process and make art out of.
What's wrong with the word cope?
Oh, I don't know. I sort of like hate that word because life, I don't think it's sort of like a victim word. You know, coping is like, oh, you're doing everything in defense. Well, I don't really like the connotations of that for me personally. Like, I don't like feeling like I'm coping. I like feeling like I'm living, even if it's just living through, but I'm living and growing and learning from things. You know, I'm a very kind of like proud and arrogant person. I don't like to think of myself as someone who's just coping.
You're not coping with the situations, with the feeling, but using the feelings and the situation.
Yeah, using and accepting it as this is how the universe is coming. This is God. Everything is God, and it's not a mistake. It's something presented in order with meaning, and I ought to honor it with a response specific to what I think is my purpose, which is to write about it, or if not about it, through it and around it in response to it. So that's why I say, you know, when the lockdown, shutdown, whatever you call it, happened, I knew I needed a new project, and I started a novel and finished it. Like, I couldn't have lived through the year without it. Even though I was working on other things, it was like, my novel writing for me is extremely personal. You know, I mean, I don't know who could write a novel and it not be personal. It's like, you know, it's your dream and it's your mind and your fantasy and your intelligence and how you want to connect, what do you want to make. I mean, everything about it is very personal and it can come from a very private place. So yeah, that was the same in Death in Her Hands. And I didn't know where I was going with it. I just somehow kind of discovered the opening, which was the note, like you described, and saying her name was Magda. Well, here's her dead body. Nobody knows who killed her.
It wasn't me. Yeah.
And from that, it was as though the narrator came to me as the person who picked up the note. Suddenly I was in her mind. And I said, okay, this is it. She started talking, responding to the note. And like the whole book is basically a response to that one note.
You had no idea how it would end. Did you know that for?
No idea.
No.
All I said was every day, I'm going to write 1,000 words. And I'm never going to look back at what I wrote on any previous day. And I will do this until I have reached the end of a novel. That was all I told myself. And in a way, that was like all I could really handle. And I remember just at some points feeling like, oh, I'm really like, oh, this is real drudgery, you know, like I don't have 1,000 words in me today. I don't know where they're going to come from. And sometimes those were the days that, you know, I took a different turn and there was something exciting there. Or, you know, those are the days where it's just totally boring. And then other days there was a sense of incredible freedom because I didn't have to fulfill any other expectation than to let my character speak through my writing. And I allowed her to kind of say and do whatever she wanted to do without feeling any kind of like authorial pressure.
So the story developed while writing. You had no idea how it would end. It only surprised you page after page. What surprised you the most?
I'm trying to remember. I think what surprised me the most is how I remember there was something really strange about how my narrator was approaching language and hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Like if she had a thought and she put language to it, it was almost as though she was doing a close reading of her own language, extracting meaning from it, and then saying, well, then that must be true. And, you know, it resembles kind of like, I mean, I don't really often judge people as being like psychotic or something. I don't know very many psychotic people, but there was something so powerfully crazy about that. And then at the same time, so attractive because it was like she was a writer. She was putting language to thought and imagination and extracting meaning from it as though it's true. She was creating fiction. So she was like my partner. And it was just like interesting to see her doing that while I'm doing that with her.
Yeah, it's funny. It's all about a certain type of loneliness. Again, she says, if it wasn't for my dog, if I didn't have Charlie, I would go mad.
Yeah.
Well, I as a reader see her go mad anyway, but it tells us maybe you need somebody to not go crazy. Is that true?
I think I don't know anybody who does well in complete isolation for long periods of time. Like, perhaps if you are really working spiritually very hard and have a destiny to be, someone who really thrives on that, and you welcome all of the ways that your mind can change in seclusion and in silence or whatever, communing with whatever you want or whatever's there. But I can see that happening. I don't know anyone like that personally, probably because I wouldn't have occasion to get to know someone intimately like that. So, again, I don't think there are any rules here, but I don't perceive that being completely alone is all that great for anyone. Although I'm sure that there are, sometimes the pros outweigh the cons. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think the word loneliness is really all that correct in this when we talk about isolation, because loneliness, as I understand it, is really a desire to connect and not have connection. But I think that if there are, I can imagine that there are ways to connect that have nothing to do with other people. So being alone, isolated for long periods of time doesn't necessarily mean that you're lonely. Just imagining, it's possible.
There's a question from someone called Salman. He or she wants to know how we can read between the lines and see your own loneliness in your work.
I mean, that's up to your interpretation. I mean, I don't think anyone can tell you how to read between the lines. Reading between the lines is, how do you feel about it? There's no secret message there. It's like, read the book, and if you have a feeling, it may be the feeling that I wanted to arise in you. And so I'm talking to you through your experience of reading the book. Based on that interaction with me, you might intuit how I'm feeling, but there isn't like anything. I'm not going to say like, oh, this part of this character is based on my experience and this is that person who hurt me or whatever. I don't really work like that. Reading between the lines is something I've never really been good at because there are no words there. It's all you. It's all just projection of what you want to see.
Let's go to the other questions. Tessa wants to know, what are your sources of inspiration? Which writers inspire you?
I'm not as inspired by writers as I am by film these days, especially. But what's funny is that the things that inspire me the most are really my own memories, as though I'm watching a movie or reading back on some recollection. I tend to write a lot from a memory of my own life and sort of build a world around a sense of it. Not quite so literally, but It's always such a hard question because everything that I read influences me in some way, and I become very sensitive to novels, especially when I'm writing a novel. Like you can get, or I can get a little bit muddled if I'm reading an amazing novel while I'm trying to, put together some rudimentary crap like level of a book, and feel like, oh my God, like how come this isn't coming together in this miraculous way like this novel has done. And also the voice, like I'm very easily enchanted by voices, and if I have a voice that I'm reading, it can get into my head, and then suddenly I'll want to talk like that character and write like that character. So I don't read a lot of fiction when I'm writing fiction. And if I do read fiction, it's usually like fiction from like 100 years ago, like something that feels really gone, like that only lives as a book, that's not really living in the present consciousness. So I tend not to read my contemporaries very often, which is kind of a state of forced loneliness, because I don't know what other people are doing. I did read a book recently that I liked very much, and I can't talk about it because now I can't remember what it's called, so this is totally pointless. But my approach to reading is like I like to read things and sort of let them wash over me as books and not think about the author or the context or even so much the content. I just like the psychic experience. Usually. Right now I'm reading Perfume.
Well, a good choice. And you're not writing at the moment.
I'm not writing a novel. I just finished a novel, and I'm working on some film screenplays. So, yeah, I can read novels freely now.
Working on some screenplays? Tell me more.
I've been writing screenplays. I started about 3 years ago, and mostly I've been adapting my own novels into screenplays, and that's been really interesting, learning both a new form of storytelling and also revisiting these stories that I wrote in the past and reimagining them. Has been really cool, and I think taught me a lot about how I want to write novels in the future.
What did it teach you?
Well, hard to put into words exactly what the lessons were, but I can say that this novel that I just finished was the first novel I've written in the third person. And it's got a big cast of characters, and the point of view moves through all of them like rotationally as we watch them do things. And that seems more filmic to me because it's not an interior point of view that precludes objectivity. I don't know if that makes exact sense, but we can watch these characters do things and sort of understand their interiority, but we're not trapped inside of their own mind. And the way, I mean, I was thinking a lot more scene-oriented storytelling. Mm-hmm. There's certainly plenty of exposition in this new novel, but I really focused, probably because it was third person and I was not the narrator. You know, the I, whether I, and
Yes.
I am not the narrator of this book.
I understand, yes.
Yeah, I was focusing more on, you know, my instincts were a little bit like, okay, what do I want to show next? Not so much like, what's the next thought I want my character to have?
And those characters, are they more social than ever or still lonely people? How did it fit in your work?
It's a range. It's a range. The novel takes place in a fictional village in medieval Eastern Europe. So it's a very different society. And the characters that I follow are sort of the exceptional characters in the village, not because they're so great, but because they have a stranger experience than the person, you know, in the next field. And so when you have something happen to you that's different than everyone else, I think it just automatically estranges you from a society, and you end up having to adapt to live as an individual in a more profound way. So in that sense, my characters are still very isolated, but they do interact with one another, and it's those interactions that build the story.
I cannot wait to read it.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for writing this, well, funny, disturbing novel, Dead in Her Hands, De Dood in Haar Handen. Thank you so much, Otessa Moshfegh.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to meet you and to chat.
Thank you so much. And that's how we end this show. I want to thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. I hope to see you in real life, maybe on screen. But thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon. Goodbye.